On that note, we should get to our first issue, which is issue 1, federal factor.
Protests in Portland, Oregon have occurred every day since late May. While some have been peaceful, others have resorted to anarchist violence. That motivated President Trump to send in federal law enforcement officers. But while Portland's mayor and Oregon's governor are protesting the federal deployment, Trump says he's ready to send federal law enforcement teams to other cities that are experiencing crime waves. Chicago, for example.
Pat, one of the interesting things here is the dichotomy between President Trump, mayors like the Chicago mayor, Lori Lightfoot, who said about 30 minutes after a shooting, which he obviously had not been briefed about, where 15 people were shot at a funeral home, this was Gestapo-like tactics. I mean, why is this so divisive, do you think?
Well, it's a real political issue. Let's take the Portland issue. Quite frankly, the federal agents were sent into Portland because the Mark Hatfield building was in trouble. It was being abused and attacked at night, and the mayor wasn't doing the job in protecting it, and so they sent those folks in there. But the overall thing here, Tom, is that what Trump is doing, he's putting a spotlight by sending these agents in there, some of them working with folks, as in Chicago, to underscore the fact that the liberal Democratic mayors cannot control outrageous riots. They cannot control crime, which has gotten totally out of hand with this defund the police. And Trump is turning this, using federal folks, into an issue between us and them. We can handle law and order, and these folks have proven over the years that they can't do the job.
Eleanor.
Well, let's start with Portland first as well. The president is treating the Homeland Security operatives as though they're his private militia. Yes, there is it's constitutional to protect a federal building, but that constitutional authority ends at the steps of the bottom of that building. And instead, they went out into the community in camouflage, fully armed, picking up protesters and carrying them away in unmarked cars. Frankly, if this were a normal administration in normal times, maybe the Chicago mayor would welcome this. You're correct, 15 people were shot overnight. But she doesn't even know what those federal agents are going in there to do. What she would like them to do is to interrupt the gun smuggling. 60% of the guns come from neighboring states and are flooding Chicago. So there's room to help. But here, I agree with Pat. This is a political move to draw a line between Democrat-led cities, i.e. urban centers, and an administration that is hoping to erase the view of his leadership on the coronavirus and substitute law and order.
Mr. Chicago, Clarence Page, your thoughts?
I like that title, Tom, Mr. Chicago. I'll take it. Let me say, breaking news, Lori Lightfoot, first of all, when she was talking about Gestapo tactics, she was talking about what the agents did out there in Portland. And that there you had a peaceful setting, which was interrupted by tear gas, etc., late at night by federal agents. That's the term we journalists use. But getting back to Chicago, quietly after the bombast between Mayor Lightfoot and President Trump, quietly Wednesday, they talked on the phone. And Trump agreed with Lightfoot that there will not be a Gestapo or police rolling in like military troops in camouflage uniforms. They were going to work with the Chicago police. They were going to work with the U.S. attorney. But Lori Lightfoot trusts, because guess what? Lori is a former prosecutor herself. She worked with the current U.S. attorney. She is not the disband the police kind of candidate that President Trump makes her out to be. And they talked peacefully and productively and arranged for the federal officers to work with Chicago PD in dealing with these crimes, which are not military crimes. They are street gangs, or they are domestic problems out in the neighborhoods. And Chicago's always ready to get some help with a problem like this, but not just to be a political stunt.
Alexander, is there a danger here, though, with Democrats calling police officers, federal agents, Gestapo, the people which bring to memory by history, taking Jews in the middle of the night and throwing them in concentration camps, torturing people, that they play to that narrative that President Trump presents of Democrats are anti-police, anti-law and order, and not pro-police reform and pro-better civil society relations?
Tom, I think this is going to backfire spectacularly if the federal authorities continue to be deployed to these Democratic cities, because the imagery you're seeing out of Portland is the disorder that Donald Trump owns. So if he thinks he's playing a Nixon game here, a tactic, Clarence is right. This is ill-fated, just as the visit to the church in DC was ill-fated, with a massive popular uprising against these kinds of tactics and gassing largely peaceful protesters. Now, there can be a conversation, an honest conversation about who's instigating what in Portland with respect to defacement of federal property or trespassing of federal property. But the bottom line is, this is not a winning issue for the president unless he intends to take it to every major city and the Supreme Court and Bill Barr together uphold these kinds of tactics all the way through Election Day to try to supervise the election. And that is the great fear of not just liberals, but constitutionalists, proponents of law and order. But Donald Trump, just as much as he owns the Trump virus, he owns this disorder, this lawlessness and disorder in Portland, and he'll own it in Chicago and anywhere else he sends troops.
Pat, I'm sure you agree with all of that, right?
Let me say that is, it's an absurdity. Donald Trump is not responsible for Portland. Now let's see what we're talking about. The Speaker of the House referred to American law enforcement agents as stormtroopers. Jim Clyburn said Nazi Gestapo. These are fellow Americans who are enforcing the law as best they can. Let's talk about Clarence's Chicago. On the weekend, last weekend, there were 70 people shot and 20 of them were dead. On Monday, there were 25 shot. On Tuesday, there were 15 people shot at a funeral in something that made the Valentine's Day massacre look like a tea party. This is what's going on in America. And what we hear is people are griping and moaning and groaning because Trump's sending in some federal people. Do you really think these folks that work for the federal government are Nazi stormtroopers? I think it's appalling, and it's going higher and higher because of this defund the police movement. I think it's a tremendous issue, an important issue in both in policy and political terms. Trump is right.
I'd like to point out that domestic policing is not a federal responsibility. This is unconstitutional. And if people are using those kinds of terms, I remember Republicans using jackbooted when Democrats sent federal troops into various areas. There's a genuine concern about how this president is undermining the Constitution. This is a very authoritarian move. He had the guise of protecting the federal building in Portland, but now he's got crime fighting. What's happening in these cities is not new.
Clarence, concluding comment.
I can only imagine that if President Obama had ordered troops into various cities without consulting the local government, how do you think they'd react? You'd be hearing once again the same kind of stormtrooper rhetoric. I think for good reason. It is unconstitutional, and it's an obvious election time stunt. And it's sad that President Trump, after 4 years, hasn't found something new to say on these issues. He just goes back to the same old tropes because he's digging deeper into his base now, rather than even try to get crossover appeal. And that's what's really sad and tragic about all this.
Alexander, very quick.
I echo what Clarence said. Look, we know that there's pernicious crime in these cities. By amplifying it, Trump is only going to hurt himself.
Okay. I think actually I'm going to agree with Pat on this one. Whatever his motives, and I suspect they're more political than law enforcement, in the failure of state and local authorities to protect their people, the first duty of government is to step in and do that. President Trump is right to do that. Democratic mayors have failed in this regard.